Alright, so everyone, and welcome back to the world of Hearthstone 4, and today I'll be playing as Democratic Japan. Now this video serves as sort of a sequel to the Japan versus Germany video that I did about 2 weeks ago, in which we sort of tested out the capabilities of fascist Japan going up against the German Reich, or the Axis in general, whether fighting on the Western Front or the Eastern Front. In that video we tested out both, and we found out that the Eastern Front was basically much easier compared to the Western Front for fascist Japan to fight on against the Axis when it comes to a land war. We also found out that the Japanese basically replaced the Americans in that scenario, and that their naval superiority is just too overwhelming for the Axis to actually handle. Now in this video we'll be basically doing an extremely similar situation, however we'll be playing as a Democratic Japan, and specifically trying out playing on the Western Front while building a more, let's say, allied type of armed forces. Now what that means is that we'll be focusing on a 40 width infantry battalions, or 40 width infantry divisions more rather, with extensive artillery, anti-air and anti-tank support, or anti-tank and anti-air battalions integrated within the 40 width infantry divisions, and going down the superior firepower doctrine. So we're basically emulating the American army of the late 1940s, let's say, or within the sphere of Hearthstone 4, and or the strategy more rather, and without the tanks, so more of an American approach, more of a Japanese approach to the situation, due to their extensively good infantry buffs and everything that they get, from the state Shintoism or whatever it is, where you get additional division recovery. Then you also get the superiority of will, which gives you additional infantry bonuses, and etc. etc. You just get insane infantry bonuses, making Japan one of the best infantry nations in the entire game. And so we'll be doing a more infantry-based approach to an American style of combat on the Western Front of the within the Second World War against the Axis, let's say. And I think this Democratic Japan approach is a little bit different to what people usually expect, because when you play Democratic Japan, if you actually take a look at the focus tree, well, initially, of course, you get a giant political power debuff by challenging these Batsus and doing everything like that, which is sort of interesting because, I'm not entirely sure if the democratic powers would be able to do something like that just coming out of a civil war, or even before going into a civil war, which, I'm emphasizing the civil war for a reason, because I find it completely, terrible. It's a terrible approach to a focus tree, because I can understand within the communist focus tree, it's a completely different beast. It's an ideology that was sort of very much feared throughout the entirety of Japan, and I find it kind of ludicrous that the developers of Paradox didn't put a communist focus tree for the German Reich, because they said it was too unrealistic. Well, I can tell you which country hated the communists the most, and it wasn't the German Reich. It was, that's right, Japan in the 1930s and 40s. So, well, I think that's, I think that's a little bit of a stretch, but, I can see the civil war situation in the communist path of the Japanese national focus tree. However, in the democratic path, I think it's a little bit unreasonable to have a civil war, and I wouldn't say that if you were actually able to flip to a democracy without having to go through a civil war, without using various mods or cheats. But you can't. I've tried many times and nothing happens. You can gain essentially 100% democratic support, and nothing happens. Nothing happens. Your stability is tanked, and you still stay as, let's say, the fascist Japan that you start the game with. So you have to go through a civil war to actually become democratic. And I think this is absolutely ludicrous, because, for example, in America, in the United States within the game, you can go fascist just by going through an election. You don't have to go through the Confederate States and Civil War and anything like that. You just have to wait for the for the popularity to rise above 50%, and you have the election, and you can turn fascist anytime you basically want. After that, however, in this, in the case of Japan, you can't do that. You can't turn democratic without a civil war, and I find that extensively ludicrous, stupid, everything like that. I think it's wrong from not just a gameplay perspective, but also a historical perspective. Democracy wasn't seen, especially constitutional democracy, or constitutional monarchy, more rather, as a state of government which wasn't seen as something extensively terrible. It wasn't seen as something terrible to be feared or anything like that. The Japanese and the British, which were a constitutional monarchy, were allies for a long time. They certainly didn't hate the British. They certainly didn't despise their form of government as much as the communists, or as much as they despise communism. So it's a long way to say that in this case I cheated and I just flipped myself democratic after I think I went to 60% democracy. And because as I said before, I think it's absolutely ludicrous to go through a civil war for democracy in the case of Japan. Now, to balance that out, because we're going up against the Axis, this is again a continuation of the Japan versus Germany situation. We try to test out the various capabilities of Japan going up against the Axis, more specifically Germany and our allies. What I decided to do, obviously, America isn't going to be joining the war, because America isn't, on historical settings, geared to go to war in sort of an interventionist nature at all. It's sort of supposed to just sit there and wait for the Japanese to attack the Philippines, and that's not going to happen, because we're going to go democratic, and we're going to fight against the Axis now. So America isn't joining in. Now, to buff the Axis a little bit, because I do understand that the civil war is supposed to balance out Japan joining the Allies, I again made Greece and the Scandinavian Empire, in essence, join the Axis and go fascist, obviously. And in addition, as opposed to the Japan versus Germany video where I made Portugal eventually go fascist, this time I united the entirety of the Benelux under a fascist Holland or fascist Netherlands, and made them join the Axis, as well as basically coring all of Belgium's overseas territories into the Benelux sort of nation, I suppose, or the nation of the Netherlands, which are now fascist. I cored all of Belgium's overseas territories and sort of decided to make Benelux great again by doing something like that, I suppose. So the Axis are even more powerful, I think, in essence, than they were in the previous video, which is quite saying something, because democratic Japan isn't all that powerful in comparison to the standard historical route Japan at all when it comes to their early game decisions. I think the most egregious example of this is obviously your inability to go to war with China at any point in time. The Marco Polo Bridge incident focus is such a big deal, in my opinion, and the ability to fight against China and take over all of China and its warlords. It's a tough word to say at 10:30 in the evening, but the ability to go to war against China and to take over all of their warlords and nationalist China, and to grind your generals and to get access to all of that, non-core manpower, or potentially core manpower if you decide to make a puppet, is such a big deal that any other focus tree has to be spectacular to counterbalance that. Now, obviously, the democratic tree allows you to join the Allies, which, as wonderful as that sounds, it's not as great as you might think, because, well, in the last video we proved that fascist Japan is so versatile that doesn't actually matter. And then it allows you to take over into China, which, you can also do as fascist Japan. Then you can take over the Dutch East Indies and Singapore, essentially, or British Malaya, more rather, as no, as puppets, which that's something that's actually interesting. Having those two nations as puppets is something that's very versatile, and the fact that you can do it peacefully without, losing any manpower, losing any industrial power, and losing anything really meaningful is, I think is actually quite substantial, because having them as puppets means that you can, well, for one, use their manpower basically freely. You don't necessarily have to take them over or annex them by military force, and you gain access to all of their resources for just one civilian factory, which eventually makes them go free, but within the scope of Hearts of Iron 4, having, just trading with them and just using their manpower a little bit here and there isn't actually enough to make them break free. So having British Malaya and the Dutch East Indies as puppets is extremely powerful. However, the main question is it actually worth as much as the entirety of China? Now, that's a question that you have to ask yourself when you get the pop-up. Are you going to go to war with nationalist China and communist China because of the communist Chinese provocation? And if you're willing to do that, then as a democratic Japan, then you have to, sort of, I suppose, not join the Allies as soon as possible. Because when you get the pop-up of joining the Allies, or we join the Allies, and that sort of roughly happens if you know what you're doing, right as Germany is trying to, or is going to, invade Poland and invade France, everything like that. If you actually get the pop-up of the the Chinese provocations on the border, then the British and the French will definitely man your border with China, which is terrible. So it's due to the AI and due to how the game works. Sometimes joining the allies too soon is a bit of a hindrance to the overall allied cause. And in essence, what I'm trying to say here is that no, democratic Japan is not as strong as fascist Japan. And in this video, we'll be trying to prove more the capabilities of Japan, trying to imitate the USA in its military strategy and its military capabilities compared to its political and focus tree decisions, because the focus tree decisions of fascist Japan or historical Japan are basically the strongest thing in the game, in my opinion, because it allows you to take over the entirety of China by 1939. It allows you to gain extreme amounts of manpower and resources by 1939. And that's when Germany is just starting to gain its industrial power, its access to various resources, etc., etc. So Japan can become extremely powerful, extremely quickly when you're going down the fascist route, and there's basically nothing that can even come close to challenging that. But when it comes to the military power of imitating an American-style military, I suppose, that's how we would say it. It's a very different beast, because in the Japan versus Germany video, we again focused more on a historical setting. We went with a 7-2 build, 20 with infantry, with sort of a standard Japanese build, which is 7 infantry, 2 artillery, not really outlandish doctrine settings, just mostly geared towards the infantry choices that you would make in the game if you were fighting against America and the United Kingdom in the Pacific. And we also didn't boost the Navy too much, but we went more of a Navy route a tiny bit, because it was more of an overall test. And in this video, again, mostly focusing on the military strategy, it's a very, it's a different beast, and we'll get to that. However, I think Japan fights very well, even with a 40 width, because again, their infantry is so insane, so powerful. That even if you hinder yourself so much as to you have to go, even if you go through the Civil War, which we aren't going to go down this video, but even if you do that. You potentially, again, grind your generals and everything like that, even within the Civil War and things like that. However, the the infantry of Japan has such powerful boosts, and it doesn't actually matter that much, even if you go for the width and sort of deviate from the standard historical line of Japan within this scenario, within Hearts of Iron 4. Even though it's not advised, at least I don't think so, because, you know, as I said, Japan, the most versatile nation, the game alongside Italy. And I think the overall, you know, even before you begin to play the game, the overall sort of situation Japan finds itself in, the democratic tree is sort of strange. Even more so with the communist tree, it's just completely strange, but you're in such a good position. Such a good position. Why would you even go down the democratic path? Because if you actually take a look at the individual focuses, well, first off, you hinder yourself with the Zaibatsu decision. Yeah, that's a big no-no from me already. Then you go down a civil war. Incredible no-no from me. You join the allies, you gain, you know, Dutch East Indies, that's pretty good. You gain into China, that's sort of, you know, standard. You gain British Malaya, okay, that's sort of okay, I suppose. And then you are supposed to fight against the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, of all people. There are no decisions within the Japanese focus tree which dictate whether you want to fight against the Axis or the Soviet Union. It's all like anti-communist volunteers and fighting against the Red Menace and stuff like that. And why? You know why? It's such an amalgamation of all the boring things of the Japanese focus tree, and you don't even get a direct war goal against the communists either. It's just, you know, bulwark against Bolshevism or whatever, and you gain a negative opinion of the communists, and the communists gain negative opinion of you. Like, why does that matter? Like, that's so pointless. If you want to fight against the Soviet Union, then go down the support the Gedoha faction or the fascist tree. You fight against the Axis, we just go down the democratic or the fascist tree, as we showcased in the last video. But as the democratic power, going up against the Soviet Union doesn't matter at all. I know it's geared towards a late game scenario in which the Americans have already capitulated Japan and are sort of gearing up for a fight against the Soviet Union in an eventual, you know, Operation Unthinkable situation, which eventually always happens in Hearts of Iron 4 for some reason. But to have that as like your main choice and the only choice in the democratic Japan game, that's so stupid. Like, I'm just gonna plainly state that. That's so inconvenient, stupid, and it basically doesn't make me want to complete the Japanese focus tree as a democracy at all. And it doesn't really make anyone want to play as a democracy at all when playing as Japan at all. You know, it's so pointless. But you know, since we're playing from the beginning of the 1930s, or beginning of 1936 more rather, within Hearts of Iron 4 as Japan, then you definitely know what's coming up. That's right, another Chinese provocation now. First time last video was the Marco Polo Bridge incident. This time, various industrial and military attacks against our forces and the civilian industry and everything like that. It's incredible. It's incredible what these Chinese think they can get away with. It's almost like they're picking a fight, and you know, that's truly irresponsible behavior. And I'm not entirely sure if we can even accept something like that within the international region. Definitely within the sphere of Eastern Asia, and as one of their major nations or that are bordering them, as one of their direct neighbors, I think it's only right. It's only right that we actually try and correct their mistakes, try and maybe teach them some good old Japanese manners, because something like this is truly irresponsible. It's truly terrible what they're doing. It's something that we just cannot accept on the international scene. Definitely as a democratic nation, we just can't just stand by and see them attack the civilian population like that. And well, needless to say, Shiropantsu Saksen number 2 is definitely a go. an absolutely stunning victory against the nationalist Chinese. However, we only get to take over nationalist China because while we do gain a war goal against communist China always joins the Soviet Union in a faction, or joins the Comintern in this case. So that's a big ol' no-no, because we don't want to start a war with the Comintern right off the bat. That would be quite terrible indeed. So let's not do that. And we do gain enough industrial power from nationalist China as it is anyway, even before taking over Indochina, the Dutch East Indies, and British Malay anyway. So this one thing is the saving grace. This one sort of decision to, get provoked by China is the one saving grace that the democratic tree of Japan has going for it. However, that's the case with every single tree that Japan has. You always get provoked by communist China when it gets to the historical settings. And it's a nice thing, it definitely boosts even a democratic Japan to gain additional power that it wouldn't have access to if we were only to go by the sort of spirit of democracy and not actually join the fight against China at all, and to only focus on the various enemies that the allies have in this game. So the Axis and the potential of fighting against the Soviet Union down the line, which the democratic Japan definitely is geared towards. However, of course, in this case, I definitely went to war with China, as you could see plainly, because one, it's a big old meme, and two, it's actually something that helps you end the war against the Axis, definitely in this case. So while we might not, get to take over the Guanxi clique, where a majority of the not sort of industrialized, but where a majority of the resources are, we do at least gain the access to at least some industrial power, at least some manpower, and at least some resources, so it's definitely a good thing. I think now would be an appropriate time to talk about the actual war that's going on against the Axis in general. As I said before, the boosts are basically them having the access to the entirety of the, entirety of Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, its coordinations, and parts of the Axis as the Scandinavian Empire, and the entirety of the Benelux as well as Greece on their side. So in this case, to deviate a little bit from the strategy presented in the Japan versus Germany video, I decided to go for the Scandinavian Empire first, because I thought it would present a more favorable case as a place of invasion for a more impactful army, and even if not taking out the entirety of the Scandinavian Empire at all, because we have a more limited access to industry, and thus a more limited manpower pool, and a more limited amount of divisions that we actually can field that would be impactful. I thought that this would at least serve as a good diversion, if not actually taking out the Scandinavian Empire with with a significant blow, so to say. And it turned out that I was kind of wrong, because while we did manage to put up quite a good fight, it turns out that well, the the old issue of the British just swarming into any sort of opening that I make is very much present even in this case. And while I eventually managed to stabilize the front, the burden that we're putting on my supply was very extensive, even though I focused on the sort of logistics companies and the logistics aspects as much as possible, building up the ports or the dockyards wherever I could, or the ports more rather, building up the infrastructure, upgrading the logistics companies as much as possible. The British really hindered my sort of advances here, because while we were able to stabilize the front in advance with the good divisions that we have, 40 with really excellent infantry, really good supporting companies, really good battalions, anti-tank, anti-air, artillery, mass firepower, stuff like that. The supply was really tight in a lot of these regions, mostly due to the Allies just eating it up wherever I went. And the Scandinavian front, I think, was quite a bit worse than I imagined initially. Initially, I thought, the Germans weren't really going to care about that much. even before Barbarossa, because it's sort of core lands of course, of Sweden, and so they wouldn't really care about me just invading there. They would sort of divert their intention to Africa, which we were already fighting in for a little bit with just 10th infantry divisions, to sort of beat back the Italians, which is a breeze because the Japanese infantry is so much better than them. But it really wasn't the combat aspect, and actually defending the foothold wasn't the difficult part. The difficult part was maintaining the divisions we have there without completely running out of supply entirely, and actually gaining some access to any access to air power or air cover, because the Japanese have access to quite good airplanes, but I obviously have to have airfields to put them in. So that was very difficult with the with the invasion of sort of the Norway part of the Scandinavian Empire that went with here. I was sort of debating whether to invade Denmark, but Denmark's much closer to Germany, and thus would be in much bigger danger of actually getting pushed back by the Germans, essentially. And so I went with Norway because it's the most out of way part of the Scandinavian Empire, apart from Iceland and Greenland. And I thought the Germans weren't going to pull up there with their panzers, and they did. So to keep a long story short, they did definitely notice the invasion and immediately took action in defending it. What's curious is that they didn't actually try to push me back at all, because our infantry was just so much better. Their attacks would just fail constantly, wouldn't actually go anywhere. But we were able to advance because our infantry was getting hindered by the lack of supply due to the British being in the way. And I think it, again, as I said last video, I think it's hard-coded for the British to just swarm into any sort of opening presented to them by their allies, because even in regular games, you see it's mostly the British puppets that do all the invasions, and the British just swarming in to those invasions. So it might be hard-coded that the British just don't invade at all, apart from like Portugal or any sort of colonial islands or anything like that. The British just don't care about mainland Europe, which is within the spirit of their whole Pax Britannica thing, but within the spirit of the game and actually fighting. I think their AI is just coded a little bit differently, but I think it's definitely interesting. However, in this game, in this case, in this match, whatever you want to call it, it definitely presented itself as a big issue for me, because when they left, that was all nice and dandy, but at that point the Germans had so many divisions on the border with us and the Scandinavians that it was not really sustainable to launch any sort of major offensive. We took a province here and there, outcircle division here and there, but until the end of the game, until the final downfall of the Scandinavian Empire and Germany itself, it still wasn't a front that was very much to our advantage to really attack, because would just get hindered down by supply constantly, and that's additional part of not being able to grind your divisions within China and the Chinese small Chinese warlords and communist China, I suppose, because while taking out nationalist China for its industrial capabilities and the additional resources, manpower, anything like that, is wonderful, you really don't get to grind your generals at all. You only get if you're actually playing properly, you know what you're doing, you encircle the Chinese armies, everything like that, and you try to gain as much as much land without taking any major casualties. Is that the main hindrance to that, and the sort of downside of that is the lack of experience that your generals gain. Because while it's fine and dandy, you gain all those bonuses, you only really are able to grind maybe 2 generals to have infantry expert, and that's nice. However, your field marshal doesn't get the logistics expert, or doesn't tend to get the logistics expert trait unlocked before you actually get into Europe. And so, by the way, those pop-ups of China is just constantly popping up, so annoying, because additional hindrance, of course, but your field marshal isn't able to get all his, great traits, your generals aren't able to get all their great traits, and you aren't able to grind as many of them as possible, as is the case with a regular fascist Japan historical playthrough, that you can really feel it when playing. Your infantry is still great, the 40 widths are amazing, and the best possible setup is to play with 40 widths as standard historical rule Japan, obviously. However, in this case, it actually wasn't all that great. We were constantly having to fight for logistics and fight for the supplies, because the British were one thing, the lack of grinding your generals in Japan in China is another thing, and overall it's not actually all that great to fight in Scandinavia. I'm going to be honest here, because while it's a major part of Europe, the logistics there in 1940, let's say, just weren't all that great, and definitely aren't all that great in Hearts of Iron 4. When it actually comes to fighting on the Western Front, which, the D-Day invasion, this universe, happened in 1941 through Belgium, which, interesting invasion, but what you tend to find is something a little bit different than what we went with in the Japan versus Germany video, is that the supply wasn't all that big of an issue, again because I teched so much into the logistics companies, and I was sort of prepared for really terrible supplies, so I invaded through Belgium because I have access to like 4 ports there. Really tried my best to mitigate the supply situation, and it went fairly well with the supply situation. However, the lowlands and the low countries are very much designed to be just blitzed through by the German tanks, even more so than France. And so we managed to hold the front a little bit here and there, managed to sort of stall the front, managed to turn it into World War One. And it went a little bit better than the invasion of Scandinavia. However, the advance was constantly being stalled by German panzers. And while, the front in Africa, we just completely dominated there. In the Western Front, we managed to destroy every single infantry army that actually went up against the Japanese, and managed to just completely annihilate them. However, due to the lack of the amount of infantry that I was able to put out due to the, again, lacking industry, we weren't able to advance all that far initially, and while we were able to, demolish them, weren't able to completely annihilate them, and the German tanks, the back of the German tanks really helped the Axis quite a bit there, because the other Axis powers, have very limited army capabilities and don't usually tech into tanks. However, the Germans do, and the German tanks are basically the best in the game, and we just got destroyed. So that's the spirit of it. And while without having the 40 width infantry, without having anti-tank battalions, without everything like that, it would have went even worse. It went somewhat bad, and we were able to somehow win the game in the end. However, in this case, the Western Front, again, terrible front for the Japanese. Completely the worst front to fight on, because they're very much geared to fighting in Japan with all their generals, and while infantry is great in something like China, India, the Eastern Front, Africa, stuff like that, the Japanese infantry just stomps. I'm sure that fighting on the Western Front, I'm sure that fighting in something like Central USA, that's just completely terrible for Japan, because the tanks have such an advantage in that situation that you can just get outcircled and completely stomped on. So while the Scandinavian front was doing well by this point, the Western Front was quite a bit of a different situation. We're constantly getting attacked. Even while the Germans were attacking, the Soviet Union were constantly getting barraged by the German tanks, even on the Western Front and the little salient in the low countries there, because it's such a good salient it's such a good country and landmass for the German tanks to blitz through. So I was trying my best to hold there. Again, the Allies, no help at all. Their infantry is just terrible as per usual, and their tank capabilities aren't as great in 1941 as they are in the late game. So it just it's not so good. It's definitely splitting up the forces between Scandinavia and the Western Front definitely, I think, is a good tactic, especially with 40 with infantry, because it sort of diverts the attention of the Axis from the Eastern Front. And my main goal by this point in the game was just to use the Soviets as the main weapon, because we weren't really advancing anywhere. So my main goal here was just to divert the Germans enough on the various fronts they were fighting, in Africa and Scandinavia, now in the Low Countries, basically diverting the attention of the Axis on 3 different fronts by very high quality infantry, very high quality stats, everything like that, to help the Soviets as much as possible, because they were really the ones that were doing the most damage. Even though in the end, I think the Germans took the most casualties fighting against Japan. They had the most casualties done to them by Japan, by like millions essentially, or hundreds of thousands. We weren't really taking any landmass from them that easily. And if the Soviets were, taken out of the game, then we would have definitely, maybe not lost, but it would have been terrible. It would have been a terrible game to play through, because it would have lasted until like 1956 or something like that. Rogue to 56, but it would have been terrible. So again, Western Front, absolutely horrible to fighting. The Scandinavian region actually was a bit better, because due to the amount of hills, it's really bad for tanks to maneuver there, and it's really terrible for tanks to do anything there. It's really actually okay for infantry to be there. So in Scandinavia, it's actually relatively fine to fight in, but in Western Front, again, completely terrible. Again, proving that the Western Front is terrible for realistically managed Japanese army to fight in. Because again, Japan excels at infantry, is really terrible with tanks, and so I'm just beating a dead horse here, but it's really true. And if we were to go by just the numbers of casualties we inflicted by constantly barraging the Axis on various fronts, constantly pushing forward, bit by bit, bite and hold strategy, we managed to do actually quite a lot in the casualty numbers, and in the ships sunk numbers, and air pilots shot down the pilots shot down stuff, and everything like that. We actually managed to do quite a lot. However, it felt terrible. It was a terrible game to play through, because the way that Japan usually fights in, completely different environment, completely different army. And while it might perform relatively okay on the Eastern Front, on the Western Front, it's such a pain to fight in. And so, overall, is democratic Japan fun? It's fun to play, yeah, it's fun to play. However, it's not fun to play in comparison with fascist Japan, which is just by miles the better country to play through, because you can do anything as fascist Japan, to be honest. And immediately after taking out the Axis as fascist Japan, you just can take out the Allies, take out the Soviets, take out whoever you want. But as democratic Japan, you have like one goal, that's supporting the Allies, and to do that, you are worse off than the fascistry, that's quite saying something. I think that your main goal is not the thing that you're geared towards as a country. Instead, you're geared towards just doing anything but fighting on the Western Front. And you can definitely help out the Allies when it comes to the Navy, and in this game we perform basically as well as in the fascist playthrough. You can definitely take out any sort of Axis members in Africa. You can invade Sicily, you can go through the individual Balkan countries quite easily, but the main front that you can help the Allies with, which is the Western Front, the main front for the Allies German sort of interaction, it's really not good. You'll do okay, you'll do actually pretty good, but it's such a grind. It's such a grindy fight, even more so than the Eastern Front, because the Eastern Front is not as well geared towards the German tanks as the Western Front, and definitely not as well geared towards the German tanks as the Low Countries are. So overall, democratic Japan, big ol' F. big ol' F in the chat, but no, it's just not as good as fascist Japan, not at all. And definitely when fighting against the Axis, you know, in different ways, it's, you know, historical fascist Japan, completely different situation from democratic Japan. However, in this test that we're doing, you know, Japan versus Axis, Japan versus Germany, democratic Japan, probably the worst, and definitely the least amount of fun that you'll have when, you know, trying to imitate this. So, you know, just avoid democratic Japan and just play, you know, fascist Japan if you want to have fun fighting against the Axis on the Western Front. And yeah, so that's that. Well, anyway, thank you guys for watching, and see you next time.